The Langford Ballroom glowed like a cathedral built for wealthy strangers. Crystal chandeliers scattered gold light across polished marble floors while the sound of violin music drifted beneath low conversations and soft laughter. Outside the towering windows, winter rain slid slowly down the Chicago skyline, blurring the city into silver and blue. Clara Whitmore stood near the entrance beside her husband, her black satin gown simple compared to the diamonds and shimmering couture surrounding her. She looked elegant without trying to compete. That was what made her invisible to people like them. Nate Brooks adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, while donors circled around him with practiced smiles and political charm. Every few seconds, another wealthy guest reached for his hand, congratulating him on the Senate campaign that seemed to grow larger every week. Clara remained beside him quietly, one hand resting against the stem of her champagne glass. Her shoulders relaxed even as the room slowly erased her. A gray-haired donor approached their table with a bright smile meant entirely for Nate. Then his eyes shifted toward Clara. "And your assistant has done a lovely job organizing tonight," he said casually. The table gave a soft laugh. Clara opened her mouth gently, prepared to correct him with grace, but Nate laughed first. Not loudly. Worse. Softly. Like embarrassment hidden beneath charm. "Trust me," he said, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "She was never made for rooms like this." The words landed quietly beneath the chandelier light, but several nearby guests heard them clearly. A woman lowered her eyes toward her wine glass. Another man adjusted his tie awkwardly. No one defended Clara. No one ever did in rooms designed around power. Clara felt the heat rise slightly beneath her skin, but her expression never changed. She simply lowered her champagne glass onto the silver tray of a passing waiter with steady fingers. Across the ballroom, a man in a dark navy tuxedo stopped walking. Julian Mercer. Even from a distance, his stillness carried weight. Conversation seemed to bend around him naturally. He did not interrupt. He did not react outwardly. But his eyes remained on Clara for 1 second too long. The donor beside Nate chuckled nervously and asked another political question, eager to move past the discomfort. Yet an older woman seated nearby continued staring at Clara with visible confusion. "Whitmore?" she asked carefully. "Did you say Whitmore?" Nate barely looked at her. "My wife keeps the old family name," he answered dismissively. The woman studied Clara again as though searching through old memories. Before she could continue, another guest pulled her away into conversation. The moment vanished. But not entirely. Julian had noticed that too. Clara excused herself quietly a few minutes later when another cluster of wealthy supporters surrounded Nate near the center of the ballroom. He barely acknowledged her departure. The orchestra shifted into a slower piece while servers moved through the crowd carrying champagne beneath the glow of hanging crystal. Clara walked toward the far edge of the ballroom near the rain-covered windows where the city lights flickered softly against the glass. For the first time all evening, the noise felt far away. She rested one hand lightly against the cold marble ledge and exhaled carefully, as though releasing something she had been holding for years. Then a waiter approached carrying a fresh glass of champagne. "For you, ma'am," he said politely. Clara frowned slightly. "I did not order this." The waiter glanced discreetly across the ballroom. "The gentleman near the west gallery requested it." Clara followed his gaze. Julian Mercer stood near the grand staircase speaking with 2 investors, but his attention shifted toward her briefly before returning to the conversation. No smile. No performance. Just acknowledgement. Clara looked down at the untouched champagne in her hand. On the opposite side of the ballroom, Nate had noticed. Their eyes met across the crowded room for half a second. Something unreadable passed through his expression before another donor pulled him back into laughter and politics beneath the chandeliers. But Clara no longer felt entirely alone inside the ballroom. And for reasons she could not explain yet, that frightened her more than the humiliation itself. The rain outside the Langford Ballroom deepened as the evening moved into its final hours. Chicago shimmered beneath the storm like a city wrapped in wet silver glass. The streets below crowded with black cars and glowing headlights reflecting across slick pavement. Inside, the ballroom remained warm with candlelight, expensive perfume, and the low orchestral hum drifting through conversations that never truly stopped. Clara stood near the tall windows holding the untouched champagne Julian Mercer had quietly sent her. The cold stem rested against her fingers while she watched rain slide down the glass in slow, uneven lines. Behind her, laughter rose and faded in waves around Nate as donors surrounded him near the center of the ballroom. He belonged to rooms like this now, or at least he believed he did. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, staring at her own reflection in the darkened window. For a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back. The black satin gown, the carefully controlled posture, the silence she had learned to wear like jewelry. Years ago, silence had not belonged to her. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You used to lecture at the Gardner Museum, did you not?" Clara turned sharply. Julian Mercer stood several feet away beneath the gold chandelier light, one hand resting loosely in the pocket of his tuxedo. Up close, his presence felt calmer than it did across the ballroom. Controlled. Observant. Dangerous only because he seemed to notice things other people ignored. Clara stared at him for half a second too long. Nobody in Chicago mentioned Boston anymore. Nobody mentioned the museum. Nobody remembered the woman she had been before politics swallowed her life whole. "A long time ago," she answered quietly. Julian studied her without hurry. "I attended one of your restoration lectures 12 years ago," he said. "You spoke about preserving damage without erasing history." Clara felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest. The memory arrived without warning. Boston winters. Dusty restoration rooms. Paintings stretched beneath white conservation lights. Her own voice speaking confidently to crowded lecture halls before she became somebody standing silently beside a politician. "I am surprised you remember that," she said carefully. Julian glanced toward the ballroom crowd where Nate continued charming donors beneath flashing cameras. "Some things are worth remembering." Before Clara could respond, a burst of applause erupted near the center of the ballroom as Nate began another campaign toast. The noise swelled loudly enough that several nearby guests turned toward him immediately. Julian looked back at Clara once more, then motioned subtly toward a quieter hallway beside the donor library. "It is difficult to breathe in there tonight," he said. Clara hesitated only briefly before following him. The side hallway was quieter, lined with dark walnut paneling and antique oil paintings lit beneath soft amber sconces. The distant orchestra sounded muted now, softened by marble walls and thick carpet beneath their footsteps. Clara exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time all evening. Julian opened the donor library door for her without touching her arm. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old paper, leather bindings, and cedarwood polish. Shelves stretched floor to ceiling beneath warm library lamps while rare art catalogs rested across polished tables. Clara moved deeper into the room instinctively, drawn toward familiarity she had not realized she missed. Then she stopped. Resting inside a glass display case near the center of the room was an old museum publication from Boston. The cover displayed restoration work from nearly a decade earlier. Beneath the photograph, printed in elegant serif letters, was her name. Clara Whitmore, Senior Restoration Consultant. Her breath caught softly. Julian noticed the shift in her expression but said nothing. Moments later, Nate entered the library mid-conversation with two campaign donors, barely glancing around the room before continuing his polished political smile. He walked directly past the display case without noticing the publication at all. Without noticing her name, one of the donors paused briefly beside it. "Wait," the man said slowly. "You are that Clara Whitmore?" Nate turned distractedly. "Excuse me." The donor pointed toward the display. "My wife attended your museum symposium years ago in Boston." Clara remained still beneath the warm library light while Nate stared at the publication for the first time, as though seeing an object from somebody else's life. Before he could answer, another group of guests entered noisily behind them, pulling the donors back toward campaign conversations and fundraising promises. The moment dissolved almost immediately, but Julian had seen everything. The silence, the confusion in Nate's face, the way Clara instinctively stepped backward from attention instead of toward it. As the room filled again with voices and movement, Julian quietly crossed toward the library door and held it open for her once more. Beyond the hallway, the ballroom noise waited like a tide ready to swallow her again. Clara paused beside him, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of the champagne glass she still had not touched. And for reasons she could not explain yet, The quiet way he looked at her felt far more unsettling than the humiliation Nate had caused all night. 3 days after the gala, Chicago woke beneath heavy gray clouds and sharp January wind that rattled against the windows of downtown office towers. Clara sat quietly inside the passenger seat of Nate's black town car, while traffic crawled through wet morning streets toward Mercer Grand Holdings. Rainwater streaked sideways across the glass, blurring traffic lights into ribbons of red and gold. Nate adjusted his tie while reviewing donor schedules on his phone without once looking at her. "You do not have to come upstairs," he said casually. "Julian only asked as a courtesy." Clara kept her eyes on the city outside. "Then why did you insist I come?" Nate gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Because powerful men enjoy nostalgia. He probably remembers some old lecture and wants to feel intellectual for an hour." Clara said nothing after that. 20 minutes later, they stepped into the towering marble lobby of Mercer Grand Holdings where silence itself felt expensive. Bronze chandeliers hung above polished black floors while employees moved calmly through the building with practiced precision. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. Even the air smelled clean and cold like cedar and winter linen. Julian Mercer's assistant escorted them to the top floor where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the frozen silver edge of Lake Michigan. Snow threatened beyond the clouds now, the sky darkening by the minute. Julian stood beside a long walnut conference table, reviewing architectural plans when they entered. He looked up immediately when Clara walked into the room. Not at Nate. At her. The subtle shift unsettled Nate enough that he straightened his jacket before speaking. "You wanted to discuss the hotel restoration project," Nate said smoothly. "I still think you would benefit from hiring someone more current." Julian closed the portfolio in front of him slowly. "I do not hire people because they are polished," he said calmly. "I hire them because they matter." The silence that followed landed heavier than the sentence itself. Nate gave a short, controlled laugh. "Of course." But Clara noticed the tightening along his jawline. Julian turned toward her instead. "The Blackstone Restoration Project requires someone who understands preservation emotionally, not just technically." He slid several photographs across the table. Historic oil paintings, water-damaged frames, architectural sketches from the 1920s. Clara recognized the building immediately. The Blackstone Hotel had once hosted presidents, diplomats, and old Chicago families before decades of neglect dimmed its history. Her fingertips brushed lightly over one photograph. Even damaged, the artwork carried dignity. "Most consultants recommended replacement," Julian said quietly. "You restored things people believed were beyond saving." Clara looked up slowly. "That was a long time ago. Skill does not disappear because someone stops being seen." Nate checked his watch abruptly. "Well, unfortunately Clara is busy helping manage campaign obligations right now." Julian never looked away from her. "I would prefer hearing her answer." Clara felt the pressure of both men in the room then, one trying to speak for her, the other refusing to let him. Before she could respond, thunder rolled faintly outside the windows. Snow began falling suddenly against the skyline in thick white sheets. By late afternoon, the storm had swallowed downtown Chicago completely. What began as a business dinner with investors inside the unfinished Blackstone restoration site became an overnight lockdown after city officials shut down major roads due to ice conditions. Guests departed early while emergency crews sealed portions of the building for safety. The vast hotel, still under restoration, fell quiet around them. Temporary lighting cast warm gold shadows across unfinished marble hallways, while wind pressed softly against towering windows. Clara stood near the grand staircase wrapped in her coat, listening to the distant hum of generators through the empty building. "You should rest upstairs," Julian said. "The roads may not reopen until morning." Nate had already left hours earlier by private security convoy for a campaign emergency downtown, barely apologizing before disappearing into the storm. Clara nodded faintly. "I did not realize Chicago storms could feel this isolated." Julian glanced toward the snow swirling outside the tall windows. "Isolation depends more on people than weather." Hours later, unable to sleep, Clara wandered through one of the unfinished restoration rooms where old paintings leaned carefully against covered furniture beneath temporary work lamps. The scent of dust, wood polish, and fresh paint lingered softly in the cold air. She removed her gloves and carefully examined a cracked antique frame resting near the work table. Her fingers moved automatically, memory returning through instinct. Then the splintered edge caught her skin. Clara inhaled sharply as a thin cut opened across her palm. Before she could reach for anything, Julian appeared beside her almost instantly, as though he had been watching from somewhere nearby the entire time. Without urgency or dramatics, he knelt beside the table and opened a small first aid kit already in his hand. "Hold still," he said quietly. Clara watched him wrap the white cloth carefully around her palm beneath the soft restoration light. His movements were calm, precise, respectful. He never once treated her like she was fragile. And somehow that made the silence between them feel far more dangerous than flirtation ever could. By February, the Blackstone Restoration Project had quietly become the center of Clara's life. Chicago remained wrapped in winter, the mornings pale and cold beneath heavy skies while snow collected along the edges of sidewalks and iron railings downtown. Every morning before sunrise, Clara boarded the northbound train carrying a leather portfolio and paper coffee cup through the half-silent city. Most passengers barely looked at one another beneath the soft yellow train lights, but Clara often found herself staring at the dark windows where her reflection flickered beside the blurred skyline. For years, her life had moved according to Nate's schedule. Fundraisers, interviews, donor dinners, smiles carefully measured beneath expensive lighting. Now her mornings smelled like cedar dust, fresh coffee, aged canvas, and oil paint warming beneath restoration lamps. The unfinished Blackstone Hotel no longer felt cold to her. It felt unfinished in the same way she was. One snowy afternoon, Clara stood beneath bright conservation lights studying a damaged landscape painting stretched across the restoration table. Tiny fractures spread through the paint like veins beneath old skin. Her gloved fingers moved carefully over the canvas while soft jazz played from a distant radio somewhere deeper inside the hotel. Julian entered quietly carrying architectural documents under one arm. He paused several feet away instead of interrupting her concentration. Clara sensed him before she looked up. "You are staring at it like it insulted you personally," he said. A faint smile almost touched her mouth. "It was restored badly 30 years ago. Someone rushed it." Julian stepped beside the table, studying the painting with calm attention. "Can it be repaired?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "Yes. But whoever fixes it has to understand what should remain damaged." Julian looked at her for a long moment then. The city snow reflected pale silver through the tall windows behind them. "He speaks to rooms," Julian said quietly. "You speak to people." Clara's fingers stopped moving over the canvas. The sentence settled somewhere deeper than praise. Nate spent his life performing for applause. Clara had spent years disappearing behind it. She lowered her eyes again, pretending to focus on the painting because suddenly looking at Julian felt strangely difficult. "Most people prefer performance," she answered softly. Julian rested one hand against the edge of the restoration table. "That does not make it valuable." The silence between them afterward felt warm instead of awkward, dangerous in a quieter way. Days passed gently after that. Clara worked longer hours inside the hotel while snowstorms moved through Chicago in waves outside the windows. Sometimes Julian left coffee near her workspace without interrupting her concentration. Other nights he walked through restoration rooms after midnight reviewing architectural plans, while she repaired damaged frames beneath soft white lamps. They rarely spoke unnecessarily, but the silence no longer felt empty. One evening, Clara arrived at the annual Chicago Preservation Conference, held inside the restored East Wing Ballroom of the Blackstone. Gold chandeliers reflected against polished marble while historians, investors, and journalists gathered beneath low orchestral music. Clara wore a dark navy gown this time, elegant but understated, her hair pinned softly above her shoulders. Nate had not attended. Campaign obligations, according to his assistant. Clara was relieved by that more than she wanted to admit. She moved quietly toward the conference seating area until a young event coordinator handed her an official program booklet with a smile. "Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore." Clara frowned slightly. "For what?" The woman looked confused. "Your keynote recognition tonight." Clara opened the booklet slowly. Her breath caught. Printed across 2 full pages was her original museum research alongside restoration credits from the Blackstone project. Beneath the title, in sharp, elegant lettering, was her full name alone. Clara Whitmore, lead historical restoration consultant. No mention of Nate. No political title attached beside her identity. Just her. She looked up immediately across the ballroom. Julian stood near the far entrance speaking with investors beneath the chandelier light. He met her gaze calmly from across the crowded room. No smile. No explanation. Only quiet certainty. He had arranged this without telling her. For the first time in years, Clara felt something dangerous move through her chest. Not humiliation. Not survival. Recognition. Later that night, long after most guests departed, Clara returned alone to the restoration floor upstairs. Snow pressed softly against the windows while Chicago glowed distant and blue beyond the glass. She stood beneath a work lamp reviewing damaged sketches when suddenly the entire floor went dark. The building power failed with a low mechanical hum. Clara inhaled sharply as darkness swallowed the room. Instinctively, her hand searched for the edge of the table beside her. Before panic could fully arrive, warm lantern light appeared nearby. Julian stood several feet away holding a battery lantern already illuminated in one hand. The soft gold light cut gently through the darkness between them. "Backup systems are restarting," he said calmly. Clara stared at him for a second longer than she should have. "You were already here?" Julian glanced toward the windows where snow continued falling over the sleeping city. "I usually am." Neither moved after that. The room remained dark except for the lantern glow between them while somewhere beneath the hotel, generators slowly began waking back to life. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago years ago, Clara realized she no longer felt invisible in the dark. March arrived slowly in Chicago, carrying melting snow, cold rain, and the first traces of spring hidden beneath gray skies. The Blackstone restoration project had become the center of quiet conversation inside elite preservation circles, and Clara Whitmore's name began appearing more often in rooms where she had once been invisible. She noticed it first in small ways. Invitations addressed directly to her instead of Nate. Curators recognizing her work before asking about politics. Wealthy donors speaking more carefully once they realized who she actually was. One Thursday evening, Clara attended a private preservation dinner inside the Astoria room overlooking the Chicago River. Candlelight reflected softly against crystal glasses, while rain tapped against the windows 30 floors above the city. Nate sat beside her wearing the polished confidence he saved for donors, his campaign numbers improving again after several difficult weeks. Across the table, a silver-haired donor studied Clara with visible curiosity before turning toward Nate. "I did not realize your wife was Clara Whitmore." The conversation around the table quieted almost immediately. Nate smiled automatically at first, but the expression faded slightly when nobody resumed speaking. The donor leaned back in his chair. "My sister still uses your restoration research in New York Museum seminars." Clara lowered her eyes toward her wineglass while the attention shifted around the table. Years ago, she would have rushed to make the moment easier for Nate. Tonight she simply remained still. Nate adjusted his cufflinks carefully. "Clara prefers staying out of public attention these days." The donor looked mildly surprised by the answer. Before anyone could continue, another guest redirected the conversation toward campaign financing, and the moment dissolved outwardly. But Clara noticed something new in the room after that. People looked at her differently now. Not with pity, with curiosity. Across the restaurant, Julian Mercer stood near the private bar speaking with investors beneath warm amber lighting. He never interrupted the conversation at Clara's table, yet she could feel when his attention shifted toward her, steady and unreadable through the crowded room. Later that month, the Chicago Preservation Fund hosted its annual fundraiser inside the newly restored Grand Meridian Hall. Gold chandeliers illuminated vaulted ceilings while a string quartet played beneath painted murals Clara herself had helped preserve. The ballroom smelled faintly of fresh flowers, champagne, and polished wood warmed beneath soft lighting. Clara arrived alone that evening after Nate canceled at the last minute due to an emergency media interview. For the first time in years, entering a ballroom without him felt strangely freeing instead of frightening. Guests greeted her almost immediately. Historians, donors, architects. Several people approached simply to thank her for saving portions of the Blackstone collection that experts believed had been permanently damaged. Clara moved carefully through the room in a dark emerald gown, elegant but restrained, answering questions softly while cameras occasionally flashed nearby. At the far end of the ballroom, Julian watched quietly from beside the staircase, one hand resting in his pocket while investors surrounded him. He never tried to pull attention toward himself. Somehow that made people notice him even more. Midway through the evening, Clara was invited unexpectedly onto the small presentation stage to speak briefly about the restoration project. The ballroom settled into silence as she stepped beneath the chandelier light. Her voice remained calm and measured while she described preserving history without erasing imperfection. "Damage tells the truth about what survived," she said softly. "Restoration is not about pretending something was never broken." The room remained completely silent for 2 seconds after she finished speaking. Then applause filled the ballroom slowly at first, then all at once. Clara stood frozen for a moment beneath the lights while guests rose from their chairs around the room. Across the ballroom, Julian's expression never changed outwardly, but his eyes remained fixed on her with unmistakable admiration. Near the back of the room, Nate had arrived quietly during the presentation. Clara saw him standing beside the entrance just as the applause grew louder. For the first time since their marriage began, she watched uncertainty move visibly across his face. The evening ended in a blur of conversations, interviews, and photographers gathering near the ballroom exit. Clara answered questions politely while flashes of light reflected across marble floors and gold walls. The crowd pressed closer around her with every passing minute until breathing itself began feeling difficult. Then suddenly the pressure eased. Julian had stepped beside her without announcement. Not possessively, not dramatically, simply enough to create space between Clara and the growing crowd. Reporters instinctively stepped backward. His presence shifted the entire atmosphere around them. Clara felt the tension leave her shoulders almost immediately. She did not realize she had moved half a step closer toward him until she noticed the warmth of his coat sleeve beside her arm. Julian never looked directly at her. "You should leave before the next press cycle arrives," he said quietly. Clara glanced toward Nate across the ballroom. He was still standing near the entrance, watching them through the crowd beneath the chandelier light while donors surrounded him with polite conversation he no longer seemed able to hear. Outside the tall windows behind him, rain slid slowly down the glass like the city itself was dissolving around him. And for the first time, Clara wondered whether Nate was finally beginning to understand what he had spent years failing to see. April rain settled heavily over Washington, D.C., turning the city streets into long rivers of reflected headlights and blurred marble buildings beneath dark skies. Clara stood inside the private entrance of the Harrington Hotel ballroom, while campaign staff hurried around her carrying folders, phones, and half-finished conversations about polling numbers and donor confidence. Nate's Senate campaign had entered dangerous territory after rumors surfaced involving undisclosed financial arrangements tied to one of his largest investors. Nothing illegal had been proven, but political circles fed on uncertainty faster than truth, which was why Clara had suddenly become important again. "If you walk away now, people will talk," Nate said quietly while adjusting his tie inside the mirrored hotel corridor. His voice carried exhaustion beneath the polished tone he used in public. Clara fastened the clasp of her black evening gloves slowly before answering. "They already do." Nate looked at her reflection in the mirror instead of directly at her. For a moment he seemed prepared to say something more honest. But the moment disappeared beneath footsteps and campaign aides approaching from the ballroom entrance. "Senator Whitmore is waiting for the donor introductions," one assistant announced nervously. Nate straightened immediately, the performance returning to his posture like armor sliding back into place. Clara followed him into the ballroom beneath towering crystal chandeliers and cold white camera flashes. Wealthy donors clustered beneath gold lighting, while political journalists drifted through conversations pretending not to listen too closely. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume, whiskey, and fresh orchids arranged across marble tables. Clara moved carefully beside Nate through the crowd while photographers called their names from across the room. Months ago she would have lowered herself emotionally to protect his image. Tonight she simply remained calm. That difference unsettled him more than anger would have. Throughout the evening, Clara noticed the shift happening around her more clearly than ever before. Donors addressed her directly now. Several guests asked about the Blackstone restoration before mentioning the campaign at all. One woman from New York spent 10 full minutes discussing Clara's museum research while Nate stood silently beside them holding a whiskey glass he barely touched. Across the ballroom, Julian Mercer arrived late beneath a storm of camera flashes near the entrance. Conversations shifted instantly around him. He wore a charcoal tuxedo with the same controlled stillness he carried everywhere. But tonight something about his expression felt colder. More guarded. Clara understood why moments later. During dinner, Julian's executive assistant quietly handed Clara a sealed envelope beside her plate. Inside was an official offer from Mercer Global Preservation Initiative headquartered in Manhattan. Director of International Historical Restoration. Full leadership authority. New York, Europe. International Archives. A life large enough to belong entirely to her again. Clara stared at the letter while voices blurred around her beneath the chandelier light. Across the ballroom, Julian never looked toward her once. Somehow that restraint carried more emotion than attention would have. Hours later, after the fundraiser ended, Clara wandered alone through the upper hotel corridor, while rain hammered softly against the windows overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. Her feet ached beneath the evening heels she had worn for nearly 12 hours. The silence upstairs felt almost unreal after the suffocating ballroom below. Clara finally stopped near an empty hallway bench and slipped the shoes from her feet with a slow, exhausted breath. The carpet felt cool beneath her skin. She closed her eyes briefly, leaning her head back against the wall while distant elevator chimes echoed through the quiet floor. For several minutes she sat alone listening to rain against glass and muted laughter drifting upward from the ballroom beneath her. Then footsteps approached softly across the hallway. Clara opened her eyes. Julian stood several feet away holding her heels in one hand. She had forgotten them downstairs beside the donor table. He set them carefully beside her without speaking, then sat at the opposite end of the bench instead of closer beside her. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his coat from outside. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain, felt dangerously familiar. Clara stared at the city lights through the tall windows ahead. New York is very far from Chicago, she said quietly at last. Julian rested his folded hands together while looking toward the rain-covered skyline. Sometimes distance is the only way people remember what they lost. Clara turned slightly toward him then, unsettled by the quiet honesty beneath the sentence. But before she could answer, Julian reached into his jacket pocket and placed the signed preservation contract gently beside her forgotten shoes. "You should choose the life that allows you to breathe," he said softly. Then he stood and walked toward the elevator without waiting for her response. Clara remained alone in the hallway afterward, listening to the sound of his footsteps disappear into silence while rain continued sliding down the windows beside the sleeping city. And for the first time since her marriage began falling apart, Clara realized the most dangerous choice before her was no longer whether to leave Nate. It was whether she was brave enough to finally choose herself. May arrived warm and restless over Chicago, carrying soft rain, crowded sidewalks, and the heavy scent of spring drifting through the city after months of cold. The largest campaign gala of Nate Brooks's career unfolded that evening inside the restored Langford Ballroom, the same room where Clara had once stood invisible beneath crystal chandeliers, while donors mistook her for hotel staff. Tonight the ballroom looked even more extravagant. Gold light reflected across polished marble floors while orchestras played beneath vaulted ceilings wrapped in white roses and political banners. Television crews waited near the entrance beside rows of black luxury cars lined along the curb outside. But beneath the glamour, pressure moved through the room like electricity. Nate's campaign had become unstable. Donors whispered carefully. Poll numbers tightened weekly. And somewhere between political survival and social performance, Clara had quietly become the most discussed person in the ballroom before she even arrived. Upstairs, hidden from the noise below, Clara stood alone beneath the grand staircase landing, adjusting the silk sleeve of her midnight blue gown. Through the carved railing she could see flashes from cameras exploding beneath the chandeliers downstairs. Her reflection stared back from the tall mirrors lining the hallway, elegant but distant, like someone standing at the edge of another life entirely. The New York preservation contract remained unsigned inside her suite upstairs. She had carried it with her all week without making a decision. Soft footsteps approached behind her. Clara turned slowly. Julian Mercer stopped several feet away beneath the dim staircase lighting, his tuxedo dark against the gold glow surrounding them. He studied her quietly for a moment before speaking. "You do not belong in the shadows of other people's ambitions." The words landed harder than she expected. Clara lowered her eyes briefly because suddenly breathing felt uneven. For years she had survived by becoming smaller inside rooms built around powerful men. But Julian never spoke to the version of her that hid. He always spoke to the woman underneath it. Clara gave a faint controlled smile. "You make it sound simple." Julian stepped closer by only half a pace. "No," he said softly. "I make it sound true." Neither moved after that. The orchestra downstairs swelled faintly beneath the silence between them while rain tapped gently against distant ballroom windows. Then an event coordinator hurried breathlessly up the staircase. "Ms. Whitmore, they are ready for the foundation announcement." Clara blinked in confusion. What announcement? But the coordinator had already disappeared downstairs again. Clara looked toward Julian immediately. He said nothing, which somehow answered everything. Minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed beneath the chandeliers as hundreds of guests turned toward the main stage. Nate stood near the podium preparing for his keynote address, while political donors gathered around the front tables beneath television cameras. Clara remained near the edge of the ballroom, uncertain why her pulse had suddenly begun racing beneath the calm expression she still wore perfectly. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Before Senator Brooks delivers tonight's address," the woman announced warmly, "the Chicago Preservation Council would like to honor someone whose work has helped restore some of this city's most treasured historical landmarks." Clara felt the room shift before she even heard her name. "Please welcome Clara Whitmore, Lead Restoration Director of the Blackstone Preservation Initiative." Silence swept through the ballroom for one suspended second. Then applause erupted from every direction at once. Clara stood frozen beneath the chandelier light while cameras turned toward her instead of Nate. Across the ballroom, donors rose to their feet. Historians applauded openly. Even political figures joined the standing ovation as her restoration work filled the massive projection screens behind the stage. Nate remained motionless beside the podium. For the first time since Clara met him, he looked completely unprepared. Not angry. Lost. Clara slowly walked toward the stage through rows of applauding guests while flashes exploded around her. The same ballroom that once erased her now seemed unable to look anywhere else. She accepted the recognition quietly, never performing for the applause, never chasing it. That restraint only made the room admire her more. When she finished speaking, reporters immediately surged forward near the ballroom floor asking questions from every direction. Clara paused beneath the overwhelming lights and movement, suddenly unable to hear individual voices anymore. Then the crowd shifted. Julian Mercer was walking toward her through the center of the ballroom. No security announcement. No dramatic interruption. Just certainty moving calmly through chaos. Conversation softened automatically as he approached. Cameras pivoted toward him instinctively. Julian stopped beside Clara without speaking, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence near her shoulder. He never touched her. He did not need to. The ballroom understood anyway. Clara looked up at him finally, her composure faltering for the briefest second beneath the chandelier glow. And across the crowded room, Nate watched the entire thing happen in complete silence, while the world he built slowly stopped revolving around him. The city changed after the gala. Chicago newspapers printed Clara Whitmore's name beside photographs of restored murals and preservation projects, instead of attaching her identity to Nate Brooks's campaign. Invitations arrived daily from museums, foundations, and cultural boards across the country. Reporters who once ignored her now requested interviews about historical restoration and preservation ethics. Yet beneath the sudden admiration, Clara felt strangely quiet inside, like someone standing between two lives, uncertain which one still belonged to her. One rainy evening in late May, she returned alone to the Blackstone Hotel after most employees had already gone home. The restoration floors remained softly lit beneath rows of warm hanging lamps while distant thunder rolled over Lake Michigan outside the tall windows. The building smelled faintly of cedar polish, old canvas, and rain drifting through cracked service doors downstairs. Clara walked slowly through the silent restoration hall carrying several archival sketches beneath her arm. Every room inside the hotel held traces of the woman she had become here. Not Nate's wife. Not somebody shrinking herself to survive powerful rooms. Herself. She paused inside the East Gallery where unfinished paintings rested beneath white linen covers and city lights shimmered softly beyond rain-covered windows. Julian stood near one of the restoration tables reviewing architectural drafts alone. He looked up immediately when she entered, as though he had sensed her presence before hearing footsteps. Neither spoke at first. Silence had become something different between them now. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Clara set the sketches carefully onto the table beside him. "I signed the New York contract," she said quietly. Julian's expression barely shifted, but something softened briefly in his eyes before he lowered them toward the documents again. "You should have," he answered. Rain slid slowly down the tall windows behind him while thunder murmured somewhere far above the city. Clara studied him carefully beneath the warm gallery light. "You always sound relieved when I leave." Julian rested both hands against the edge of the table before answering. "No," he said softly. "I sound relieved when you finally choose yourself." The room fell silent again. Clara looked toward the darkened windows because suddenly holding his gaze felt too dangerous. Months ago she would have mistaken this feeling for fear. Now she understood it was vulnerability. Julian stepped closer slowly, stopping just beside the edge of the work table. "There was never a room where you did not belong," he said quietly. Clara's breath caught before she could control it. Nobody had ever spoken to her this way. Not with possession. Not with performance. With certainty. She looked up at him finally, her composure faltering for the first time in months beneath the soft gallery light. Her fingers moved unconsciously against the edge of the table, almost reaching toward his hand resting nearby. Then footsteps echoed sharply through the hallway outside. The moment shattered immediately. A junior restoration assistant hurried into the gallery carrying inventory reports, apologizing breathlessly for the interruption. Clara stepped backward at once, smoothing her sleeve carefully while Julian turned toward the employee with perfect calm already restored across his face. By midnight the storm had intensified outside. Rain hammered against downtown windows while lightning flashed pale silver across the sleeping city. Clara left the hotel through the lower parking entrance after the final staff meeting ended. Nate was waiting beside his black sedan beneath the covered valet awning. He looked exhausted. Not politically polished anymore. Simply tired. Clara stopped several feet away from him while rainwater streamed along the curb between them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Nate glanced toward the glowing hotel above them. "I should have listened years ago," he said quietly. Clara folded her coat tighter against the cold rain. "About what?" Nate gave a hollow laugh beneath his breath. "About you." The sentence landed heavier than anger would have. Nate looked older standing there beneath the storm lights and endless campaign pressure. Smaller somehow. "I spent years thinking admiration was loyalty," he admitted softly. "I thought if people respected me, everything else would follow." Clara remained silent. Nate looked at her carefully for the first time in years instead of through her. "You were the only person who loved me before any of this mattered." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. The rain softened around them into silver mist beneath the valet lights. "You loved being needed," she answered quietly. "That is not the same thing." Nate looked away first. And in that silence, Clara finally understood something that changed everything. He did regret losing her. But even now, part of him still believed she had belonged to him. 2 nights later, Julian prepared to leave for New York after finalizing an international acquisition deal tied to the preservation initiative. The Mercertown car waited outside the Blackstone entrance while rain shimmered across the empty streets after midnight. Julian stepped through the revolving doors carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm, his driver already opening the rear passenger door. Then he stopped. Clara stood beneath the awning holding another portfolio against her chest. The one he had forgotten upstairs in the gallery. Rain drifted softly behind her while city lights blurred gold across the wet pavement. Neither moved for several seconds. Neither spoke. Clara handed him the portfolio slowly. Their fingers almost touched. Almost. Julian looked at her like he wanted to say something dangerous. Something irreversible. But the words never arrived. And as thunder rolled faintly over the city one more time, Clara realized the silence between them had become far more intimate than confession ever could be. September arrived with clear skies over Chicago, and the first cool winds drifting off Lake Michigan. The Blackstone Hotel stood transformed beneath golden evening light, every marble corridor restored, every chandelier glowing again after decades of silence and neglect. Black luxury cars lined the entrance while photographers gathered beneath velvet ropes, outside the grand reopening gala, for the Mercer International Preservation Foundation. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal light and soft orchestral music while political figures, museum directors, philanthropists and old money families filled the room beneath towering floral arrangements and gold ceilings. But this time, Clara Whitmore did not enter quietly beside someone else's reputation. She arrived alone beneath the chandeliers wearing a silver silk gown that reflected the ballroom light like moonlight on water. Conversations softened as she crossed the marble floor. People turned instinctively toward her now, not because she belonged to power, because she had become it in her own quiet way. Months earlier, she would have searched automatically for Nate inside a room like this. Tonight she searched for no one. Near the center of the ballroom, large projection screens displayed the restoration projects she now directed internationally through Mercer Global Preservation. Florence, New York, Boston, Chicago. Her work had become part of something permanent. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage while cameras flashed softly around the room. Tonight, the woman announced warmly, we celebrate not only the restoration of historic spaces, but the woman whose vision helped preserve them. Clara stood still as applause filled the ballroom around her. Then the announcer smiled toward the front tables. Please welcome Clara Whitmore, Executive Director of Mercer International Preservation. The entire ballroom rose to its feet. Crystal chandeliers trembled faintly above the standing ovation, while applause echoed across marble walls and gold balconies. Clara walked slowly toward the stage beneath the warm light, her expression calm despite the emotion threatening beneath it. Across the ballroom, she noticed Nate standing alone near the back wall beside one of the tall windows. No cameras surrounded him anymore. No donors rushed toward him. His campaign had quietly collapsed months earlier after major investors withdrew support. Yet he still applauded with everyone else, his expression carrying something deeper than regret now. Understanding. Clara stepped behind the podium and looked across the room filled with people who finally saw her clearly. For years she believed survival meant becoming smaller so others could shine brighter. Tonight she understood dignity required the opposite. History survives because someone chooses to protect what others overlook, she said softly into the microphone. Sometimes that includes people. The ballroom fell completely silent beneath the chandeliers. Clara looked briefly toward Julian standing near the front of the stage. He had watched her all evening with the same quiet certainty that first unsettled her months ago inside the Langford ballroom. Only now she no longer feared what his gaze awakened in her. When the applause returned again, stronger this time, Clara stepped away from the podium with steady grace. Julian moved toward her through the crowd as guests parted instinctively around him. He stopped directly beside her beneath the golden ballroom light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand near hers. Then, in front of the entire room, Julian gently reached for her hand and held it. Not possessively, not performatively. Like a man finally allowing the world to witness what he had already chosen privately long ago. The ballroom cameras flashed wildly around them, but Clara noticed none of it anymore. Julian looked down at her quietly while the orchestra softened in the background. Ready to go home? He asked. Not my home. Not your home. Home. Clara felt something inside her finally settle after years of emotional noise. She smiled then. Not carefully. Not politely. Freely. Yes, she answered softly. Across the ballroom, Nate lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back toward them again. There was pain in his expression, but no bitterness remained. Only the devastating realization that he had once held something extraordinary in his hands and failed to recognize it until the world taught him her value. Julian lifted Clara's hand gently toward his chest for one brief quiet second before releasing it again. The gesture was small, intimate, protective, and somehow more powerful than any public declaration could have been. Together they began walking toward the ballroom exit while guests continued applauding softly around them. Nobody tried to stop them. Nobody called them back. Outside, cool autumn air drifted through the open entrance while black cars waited beneath glowing city lights. Snow had not arrived yet, but the first hint of winter moved softly through the wind along Michigan Avenue. Just before stepping outside, Clara turned once toward the ballroom behind her. The same kind of room where she had once stood humiliated, invisible, and emotionally erased beneath chandeliers and wealthy laughter. Now the room stood behind her like a finished chapter. Julian opened the car door quietly for her beneath the city lights. Clara looked at him for a long moment before stepping closer instead of entering immediately. Then, with complete certainty, she rested her forehead softly against his for one brief suspended second while cameras flashed distantly behind them. Neither spoke. They did not need to, because the greatest revenge had never been destroying the people who underestimated her. It was becoming impossible to overlook. And as Clara finally stepped into the waiting car beside the man who saw her clearly before the world ever did, the glowing ballroom faded behind them into gold light and distant music while Chicago stretched endlessly ahead like the beginning of a life she no longer needed permission to claim.